In fact, it's natural selection, and it's through natural selection of civilizations that these ABCD cycles appear, structured by natural selection. But how? I've already explained it to you without telling you like this, but I've already explained it to you. It's the idea that civilization A is a group of states that are Amero-propagated, i.e. that can evolve in a stable way. And so one of them will achieve parliamentarianism, the first before the whole of the known world, and the first within the states of civilization A, and become a thalassocracy, for reasons I've already explained to you in previous programs. And that's what makes civilization A, and that it depends on the geography of the country, and that it depends on geography, right? You can have different places that are favorable to the appearance of civilization A, but whoever gets there first wins. So either he'll get there first because he's going faster than the others, and he starts first and therefore gets there first, or because the others died before him. And so, in this case, I found this through the case of Phoenicia. Why? Because Phoenicia was a multitude of city-states, like the Greek ones, essentially in Lebanon, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, etc., which had begun an evolution, as can be seen quite clearly when you look at it in detail, that is comparable to the first century of Greek history and before Greek history, i.e., writing was invented by the Phoenicians before it was invented by the Greeks, so presumably the Phoenicians were ahead of the Greeks, and if all had gone well, if their Mirpuri had been maintained, well, they would have become civilization A of antiquity, and presumably Carthage would have been civilization B. Why didn't this happen? Because, due to its geographical location, Phoenicia was much more vulnerable to being attacked by a civilization D, which it was, since it was invaded by the Assyrians very early on, and it's as if the Greeks had lost to the Persians, i.e., Phoenicia was completely extinguished, and therefore never reached the end of its evolution as an independent and therefore democratic state. And so it was Greece that did it. So it was at this point that I understood that the first to arrive does this, and this is very important because, as it's also a question of relationships between cycles, it's civilization A that will then determine which other civilizations are in terms of the relationships they have with them. For example, as I've already said, political monotheism, since it was at this time that the idea of monotheism, it was quite a busy March-April period for me. Intellectually, I had time for it, so I worked quite a lot. That's when I came up with the concept of political monotheism. So I realized that it was behind civilization C, but that it could also be behind civilization A, since civilization A in Europe has Christianity. Nevertheless, Europe is civilization A first, and Islam is civilization C, because it's put in this position by the fact that civilization A is already Europe. But if there had been no Europe, let's admit that Europe had been invaded by the Mongols in the 13th century and completely destroyed, Europe would probably have been plunged into darkness. Or let's admit that an asteroid fell on France and destroyed. Imagine the cataclysm you want. We'd probably now be with Turkey, Morocco, Egypt, i.e. large countries of equivalent size. And they'd be civilization A, because there'd been no civilization A before them to colonize them, put them in a difficult position, and so on. So it's really the first to arrive that dictates the others, and the first to arrive arrives by natural selection, since Europe became Europe because it was the first to arrive. And what brings this natural selection into play the most, what plays on it the most, is geography, the geographical determinisms I explained to you, in particular articulated thalassography. So you see, it was by chance that I came across Kozande's work, just as I was starting to think about this. Maybe it wasn't by chance, maybe I came across this work precisely because I was thinking along these lines, I don't know. But in any case, it all percolated. And so it was really at this point that I started to put it together and start writing the book, which still isn't out because it's not finished, since I'm still working on it. Because I really want to get to the end of things now that I've got the thread. I don't want to publish a half-finished work, which in fact synthesizes the whole model. but which I've already told you about since all the videos I've made, especially since I've injected what I've already found on this, and everything I've explained to you, for example, about what would have happened if Napoleon had destroyed England. Well, Russia would probably have dominated Europe, and then, instead of England, colonized China and India, so it would have been more like the Persian Empire conquered by the Greeks, but under Macedonian aegis, the world colonized under Russian aegis. It would have looked more like antiquity than it did. And all this is in this book that I'm preparing, and political monotheism is also in this book, that it will be well developed, or that I now had an explanation. I wasn't going to not give it to you simply because I'm going to publish a book in the next few years that will explain it all. That wouldn't have been cool. And what's more, the fact of talking about it, exposing it, etc., makes me think again. I'm going to publish a book in the next few years that will explain it all on it. So really what happened at that point in the course of this year, at the end of the year, was that I really managed to articulate all the bits and pieces I'd had before, i.e. the great cycles of ABCD civilizations, national construction, revenge imperialism, all that. I managed to mix it all up. The political monotonism that appeared at that point on top of it, but I managed to articulate it all and come up with a model that's the one I presented to you in the previous programs. And there you have it. So in September of the sequel, I published the structure of the story. The last little thing I had was in January of the following year, the article I wrote, in which I explored revenge imperialism in greater depth through the little parallel I drew between the Ukraine and Czechoslovakia, i.e. The idea that until it stopped, revenge imperialism proceeds by annexation, by successive encirclement, but that's really a detail. It has nothing to do with the job or what I'd found before. And since the summer, at the end of the year, I've essentially been working on the book I'm publishing with Leo Portal on the political divide, which is a subject on which I'd already written articles, notably for Contrepoint, since the first summer at the end of the year, I think. I had written a series of articles that I obviously used as a theoretical basis for the book we wrote, but I had to go back over a lot of stuff, and we added a lot to it, fine-tuning it, etc. There are some things I'd like to add to the book. I didn't have time to work on the other book, and in fact I only advanced it intellectually through the videos I made with you, since this forced me to resynthesize all my work since October of 2020. So here's the chronological approach I wanted to give you, which is in the form of a long introduction, but not because in fact this is how you understand how it all came about. And it's true that in my books too, in the presentations I give, I always try as far as possible to maintain the way. In my demonstration, the intellectual path I myself have taken, because it's a demonstration I make myself, in fact, by having objections come to me, by resolving the objections, and rather than starting again with a basic demonstration as if there were no problem, basically that it was a truth revealed from the start. I like that, and I find it more convincing for the reader, moreover, to see how we got there. And that's why I wanted to tell you a little of this story, because it also gives us an epistemological understanding of what histonomy is, and apparently the question had arisen at least among a certain number of listeners who had asked me what it was all about. Didier Raoult was criticized by some ethicists for saying that epistemology is the history of science. He said, I teach epistemology is the history of science, and I said epistemology is not that. Indeed, it's not exactly that, but Didier Raoult knows one thing very well, and it's what everyone who's done epistemology knows, and that's that if you want to do epistemology, you start by doing the history of science, because epistemology is the search for scientific methods, the reflection on how discoveries are made, etc. And all this you only know by doing the history of science. You can't know it any other way. So it's by studying the history of a science that you understand these methods, etc. In the lecture I'm giving on law as the science of justice, it's by studying the history of law, it's through the history of law that I explain that law is a science. So that's why I wanted to do this chronology. I hope it interested you. And then we'll be able to move on to these fundamental notions of necessary history, contingent history. I've mentioned it briefly before. I tried to explain it in the interview Henri Gleskan did on Radio Athena, myself, on the 28 last December. You have the video, but I'll try to present it more clearly today, staying specifically on that. So what is it, in fact? Quite simply, what is it? Well, the simplest thing to do, in fact, is to take up the structure of the story. I've been thinking about this book since I told you earlier that I've been thinking about this parallel between France and England, which I've extended to Germany, which I've extended to Russia, which I've extended to Spain. Well, once I'd got there, it was very interesting because I was able to show that all European countries followed the same trajectory, and that this trajectory always lasted roughly the same amount of time if we disregarded the moments that were what I call external disturbances, i.e. the 100 Years' War for France, and the Napoleonic invasions for Germany and Spain. But from then on, once I'd said that, I was happy. I said to myself that it was still a subject, it was still interesting, since nobody says that it's exactly the same thing. There are a few historians who have drawn parallels between the history of revolutions. I'm thinking in particular of Martin Malia, whom I talk about at the end of The Structure of History. And the whole political construction from the outset, drawing parallels between the Russian Zemsky Sobor, the Estates General, etc., the overcoming of the revolution and the revolution, etc., the overcoming of feudalism and so on. That wasn't in the museum, you had to do something with it. I had that, that's more or less where I was in January at the end of the year, when I started writing the background. But what was holding me back from writing this was that I thought, okay, but what are you going to put in the conclusion of this book? What's in it for you? Do you see anything to conclude with? Because, well, okay, you're going to say, well, but it's the same everywhere, very good, very interesting, it's fun. But afterwards, does it teach us anything? So I was thinking about my story of construction in a secure space and deterministic linear evolution in a closed, undisturbed space of a political community, a territory, quite simply. And I just couldn't see what to say about it. And so I did, so I'm not going to show you because it won't tell you much, but I'll show you a little bit anyway. So I was thinking about it, and as I was researching, I became interested in durations, because I said to myself, well, let's go back, because it was something I had already observed in the large cycles A, B, C, D, E, was that there were evolutionary rhythms that had always lasted about the same length of time, the same order of magnitude, and so on. And so, for lack of anything better to do, I said to myself, you're going to take this as a starting point, you're going to reflect on this, you're going to make some observations. In other words, you can't conclude, but you can say at least there's this interesting to look at already, and so you'll have to look at it. Well, if it's for lack of a better word, that wouldn't be bad. So to explain that there's a similar rhythm, that we're observing roughly the same durations and so on. And so I made a number of diagrams like this, where I made comparisons of duration to show that it always lasted about the same order of magnitude. And then comparisons of duration by stage 2, like this, saying to myself, first there's the purely feudal stage, then there's the moment when the general ethic is created, the representative assembly, then the moment when the revolutionary movement arrives, the duration of the revolutionary movement, and so on. And I said, you see, we could see correspondences. And so I thought about it, but I couldn't quite see where it was leading. And in particular, I was thinking, despite everything, why is it that sometimes there are big takeoffs, things move in one direction or another? A certain thing, for example, happened much later in one place and not in another, without any a priori explanation. And that's what conceptually led me more and more towards my solution. And the solution to all this was what I call the laws of history, which are the laws I formulated, which I'm going to read to you again. Since these laws, in fact, is the necessary history. Let me briefly remind you, because I've already said it, but it's a good place to start. Necessary history and contingent history are as follows. Necessary history is the part of history which is certain, which is determined. It's the things that are going to happen in a certain order, in a necessary way. Contingent history is the way things happen. In other words, who will actually play what role? Will it be Napoleon Bonaparte, the French imperialist and avenger? Could it have been someone else? Was it random? That wasn't determined. For example, would Would the Russian Revolution have taken place if Lenin hadn't been sent on his train? Yes. Maybe I'll get to the interesting cases like that later. But let's say that necessary history and contingent history is the one we observe. The necessary story is the part of the story that was necessary, that couldn't have happened any other way, or in any case, that had to happen somehow. And the necessary story is very important. Why is that? Because it's what allows you to determine the tree of possibilities. It also allows you to determine the right causalities, since it gives you a causal chain at the heart of the story that drives it. And if you add, it allows you to isolate all the variables that are proposed as explanations and that don't fit into the necessity. You can discard them. You can say, no, it doesn't matter. In terms of historical research, it's an extremely powerful tool, since the aim is to look for causalities in history. That's the historian's ultimate goal. It's not just to say what it was like, it's to try and say, it happened, why it happened. If you have a tool that already tells you half the explanation is garbage, it's a huge help. So that's the first advantage of the necessary story. It also helps you when you're thinking in a chronic way, where you're trying to figure out what would have happened if... to rule out all the bogus scenarios that couldn't have happened because the necessary history told you that this wasn't what could have happened. So necessary history is really fundamental, because what makes cycles happen is necessary history. Cycles are in fact necessary history. The whole big model I'm doing is a necessary history model. I can't tell you exactly how things are going to work out because that's contingent, but I can tell you that this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen, and this is what I've explained to you in my very long-term predictions for the coming century and beyond. But every time I tell you, it could happen like that, it could happen like that, but I don't have the final word, all right? And the necessary history, in fact, the laws of history, the laws that dictate the necessary history, that's what you have to look for. That's interesting. And that's what I'm looking for, because it corresponds, if you like, to the few provisions in the cellular automaton that choose the color of a piece and that end up making complex structures appear. What are the fundamental rules that allow these complex structures to appear? Well, the list is not exhaustive. These are the laws I formulated in the structure of history, and which I still consider valid, and which are valid at several levels, whether observed at national level, at the level of major cycles, etc., and which apply at all these levels. And perhaps I could formulate, I haven't yet thought about how I could formulate it exactly, add what I said about the application of natural selection. But for the moment, I'll stick to the 4 laws I formulated, which can be stated as follows. In a given political community, not subject to external disturbance, i.e. a territory as long as nothing else is involved, these are the laws that dictate the evolution of a political community that you place relatively under a bell, all by itself, which is the pure product of its internal evolution. Firstly, a general situation doesn't transform itself in the absence of some associated breaking event. So what is a general situation? For example, it's the feudal order, with all that implies, economically, intellectually, whatever you like. The idea is that at the level of the political community, you don't get out of this until you have, through one of the feudal chiefs who will be the most powerful, so generally the king in our European history, the formation of an institution representative of the whole of society, of the whole of mankind, of the entire society, the entire national community, clergy, nobility and bourgeoisie, in this case for the Estates General, and which enables feudalism to be overcome. So that's the idea I had of this rupture event that we need to identify, which isn't necessarily the right one since I've identified it like that for Europe. But I realized in dealing with the major cases of Muslim countries, i.e. Morocco, Turkey, Egypt, Iran, that in these countries, overcoming feudalism doesn't involve creating a representative assembly because there isn't one. It involves, so in fact the representative assembly isn't the condition for mutation. It seems that the condition for mutation is power's ability to set up a standing army. A standing army that makes it possible taxes to be paid under the threat of force, and conversely taxes to feed the standing army. And so this is what sets in motion a new cycle, which is the construction of the sovereign state, which enables us to move away from the feudal order, which is in fact what's important. And in the Muslim countries I mentioned, the problem had not been resolved by the creation of an assembly that authorized the feudal sovereign, the king, to levy taxes, because that's what the representative assembly actually does. Create a tax that can then be used to finance the standing army. They didn't need it in those Muslim countries because they had the institution of slavery, which didn't exist in European countries, but which allowed them to create troop corps based on slavery. So the Moroccans had a corps of, what's it called again? I don't know, it's a complicated name in several words anyway. Adi al-Bukhari, I don't know. Well, it's a system like that. It's a troop conscripted by slavery. It's the Mamelukes in Egypt. It's the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire. And it's the Ghulams in Iran, in Kat Iran, who, through this institution of slavery, created an elite corps of troops which then enabled them to impose themselves on other lords, to establish a system of taxation, and thus to finance, once again. That's how they do it. So, presumably, this is the breaking event. Well, there's a breaking point at the end of every shift from one general situation to another. Presumably, what I can identify with some certainty in national construction. The first, starting with feudalism, is the construction of this central power and its ability to create a permanent army and a permanent tax. This builds the sovereign monarchy. The next stage was the revolutionary movement, which lasted some 40 years. These are the two examples that come to mind. There are others, in fact, but let's just say that schematically, that's what allowed me to identify this law. So I'll read it again. A general situation cannot be transformed in the absence of a certain associated breaking event. You can't achieve a sovereign state on the basis of a feudal society if at some point you don't have a power like that, which imposes itself and transforms the regime by truly creating a state, and you can't have a state that then becomes parliamentary and sees what's happening through a revolutionary movement that changes landed elites for market elites, which I remind you is what characterizes the revolutionary movement. You can't have that if you don't have a revolutionary movement. And so it doesn't transform the general situation of the country. So feudalism can't be transformed into something else if we don't go through the bottleneck that is this evolution. And sovereign monarchy can't be transformed into something else, in particular a parliamentary and colonialist regime, if we don't go through this change of elite that takes place through a revolutionary movement. So that's the first law. Second law. In the absence of the reuse of the associated rupture event, a general situation evolves only in the sense of a progressive actuation of its distinctive features. This is the idea that a general situation is distinguished by certain features. I won't go into examples here, otherwise I won't have time to explain. But it is characterized by certain features. It's these characteristics that eventually over time produce an evolution that leads to the breaking event. For example, it's the characteristics of feudalism that eventually lead to the emergence of, I don't know, inheritance, the fact that Germans are by marriage, etc., which eventually lead to the emergence of a suzerain who will be able to convene the assembly, etc., or create more elites, etc., and permanent taxation. And these features become more pronounced or accentuate their effect until the breaking event occurs. The third law, and you'll see what it comes down to, is that the progressive and highly distinctive accentuation of a general situation over time makes it proportionally more likely that the associated breaking event will occur. In other words, these three laws allow you to model historical determinism. That's my idea. Why is that? Because, quite simply, I'm telling you, I'll take the case of the suzerain who convenes the Estates General, let's call them that generically, and sets up a permanent tax. It's the product of the evolution of this feudal order that exists, of this general situation of feudalism in the Middle Ages. It produces this suzerain, all right, and it is he who will have the ability to set up this permanent tax. In France, the very first suzerain to begin expressing the idea of sovereignty, or suzerainty in any case, was Louis VI le Gros with the Abbé Suger. I think it's called Suger. L'Abbé Suger, I think that throughout my childhood, it was as I saw the word written, I always thought it was pronounced Suger as it's written. In fact, I think it's pronounced without the title sujet, who had perfected the theory of the movement of fiefs, i.e., the idea that feudalism is a pyramid that goes back to the suzerain. So that's the first affirmation of suzerainty, if you like, the first thing that points to the need to get out of feudalism. But at the time of Louis Cyclo-Gros, who was the first to move in this direction, explicitly, relatively speaking, he would have been incapable of setting up a permanent tax. Simply the suzerainty of the kings of France, thanks to the laws of feudalism, which ensure transmission, etc., and alliances through marriage, which lead to a gradual concentration of power and wealth, all these factors lead to suzerains who are increasingly established, increasingly strong, and therefore increasingly capable of doing what Philip the Fair did, i.e., general state and permanent tax. Okay? This means that from the moment when the characteristics of a general situation begin to come into play and thus produce an evolution, the end of this evolution is necessary. It tends towards a point. To draw a parallel, I believe that in chaos theory we call this an attractor. It's the place towards which solutions go. I'm not a specialist in chaos theory, but I once had a discussion with a mathematician who told me that it was probably the closest to the idea I was trying to put forward, at least what he knew seemed closest. So what does that mean? It means that over time the probability of the event occurring keeps increasing. What does this mean? In concrete terms, it means that at t, the possibility is 5%. 5% at t2, it's 10%, at t3, it's 30%, at t4, 40%, etc., up to 100%. Except that it doesn't wait until it's at 100% to realize itself. It's more likely to come true when you're at 50% or 60% than when you're at 100%. It's rare for it to take up to 100%. And that's what makes the difference in time. That's why you have a rhythm. That's why you have a rhythm in deterministic evolution that's always the same. Because it's a probability that increases over time, and so on average it always happens in the same region, but it can happen a little later, or sometimes it happens very early, sometimes it happens when it can't happen any other way, and sometimes it happens very early because you have a particular character who's going to bring his particular talents to bear. He'll be particularly assertive, I don't know what. So he'll be a king who, even though he's not practically forced by the situation to do what he's got, will make this decision before, or because he's more intelligent, more visionary, whatever you like. So where it's going to happen, that's contingent. But the fact that it's going to happen, that's necessary. Understand, this is the structure of history. That's what I'm explaining in the structure of history. The articulation between necessity and contingency takes place according to this model, according to these laws. That's what it means, these laws, the articulation between necessity and contingency. To give you another parallel, if you want to understand, it's a mechanism that's often used in video games like this one. I don't know if you play Europa Universalis, for example, which is practically a model of European history over certain centuries. It's interesting because, you know, for example, that there's a revolt, the game regularly tells you halfway through that it's happening and so on. And the same goes for siege events. When you're conducting a siege of a city or whatever, the system is actually quite simple in that you have a die roll every certain period of time. I don't know, every 20 seconds, for example. You have a die roll, and let's say a die roll of 6. Okay? Let's imagine that what we're doing here in concrete terms is that you roll a die with 6 phases, so it goes from 1 to 6. And the result you have to get for something to happen is 14. So when you roll your 6 die, there's a 0% chance that your result will come up. It never will, since you have to get to 14. But every time you roll the die, for example every 20 seconds, you get an extra bonus of 1. So the first time you roll the die, it's at 0, so the most you can do is 6. Second time you'll get plus 1, so you'll roll. The maximum you'll make is 7, probability of you making it 0, and then it increases, which means that it's only from the 8th throw, when you'll have plus 8, that you can hope to reach 14 by making 6. But you won't necessarily make 6 on the 8th throw, so you might make 8 plus a 9, so it won't happen. So the probability increases to 100%. 100% is when you have a die that's plus 13, because at that point, even if you roll 1, you're sure it's going to go through, right? It's the same thing, really. I'm just giving you this as a concrete example so that you understand how probability increases, how we model the increase in probability over time, and how we arrive at this. So here are the three laws that explain the difference between contingency and necessity, and how contingent history and necessary history are characterized. And the fourth law I've added is that an external disturbance has a temporary effect on the evolution of the political community proportional to its magnitude. This seals the fact that the main condition of the three laws, in fact, is that you don't have an external event disrupting evolution. And why is that? It's easy enough to understand because, as I said, a general situation in the absence of external intervention increases its distinctive features continuously over time until the intervention of a breaking event. This means that if another external event occurs, this can be the case in France during the 100 Years' War, when the monarchical state was being built, pacifying the land, crushing feudalism, and so on. Boom, you've got the kings of England riding in, creating insecurity, discrediting the King of France, and so on. This sets back the monarchical state's ability to build and the royal authority in the country, and then you have to take the time to rebuild it. So that's how you fall considerably behind in the statistical race, the evolution that will take you to the next stage. You simply fall behind. You have other cases where, on the contrary, and this is the case of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars in Germany and Spain, outside intervention, basically. Napoleon is the outside intervener in Germany and Spain, destroys a traditional order and injects something that's not there yet. And injects something that's ahead of its internal race, because Germany, she says Spain at the time, wasn't on the same evolutionary level as revolutionary France. It was behind. The only country that was ahead of France, the only country of comparable size to France that was ahead of France, was England, which had made its revolution 150 years earlier, but France was ahead, so it brought the civil code, the abolition of privileges, etc., to countries that weren't ready for it, because it gave them a head start on certain things, but at the same time it created very shareholder phenomena that made them go backwards. And so you had a succession of revolutions, changes of dynasty that shouldn't have taken place if these countries had been left alone. And so even the fact of intervening from the outside doesn't make it possible to accelerate the construction of a country. This too is an important lesson of historical necessity. For example, incidentally, because there's a lot that can be learned from historicalonomy, but it also discredits the idea of nation building. The Americans went into Iraq thinking they were going to make a democracy. So why did they do that? Because they'd been convinced for 945 years that they could create a democracy by force of arms, because they'd arrived in Germany and because they'd arrived in Japan. What they didn't understand was that Germany and Japan were on the verge of becoming democracies on their own. They were at the end of their own revolutionary movements, so parliamentarianism was going to take hold. There was no problem. They were just 10 years away from doing it on their own, and so if the Americans didn't succeed, it's just that they hastened the thing a little because they were just before it. And so their outside intervention didn't break the evolution, it just hastened the final event. Whereas in Iraq, we weren't at all on that. In Iraq, we were dealing with a country that was still at the level of an administrative monarchy, and so it's far too early. It's like if you start the revolution in the France of Louis XIV, it doesn't work. You're sure there's going to be an absolutist backlash. It's not going to happen like that. So there you have it. So that's four very important elements to understand. It may seem that the fourth law is a repetition of the contextual character of the laws. Since I told you that the condition and prerequisite for the three laws I mentioned is within a given political community and not subject to external religious disturbance. So you're going to say to me, Coco, if you add a fourth law that says that if there's an external disturbance, it breaks everything, you're saying the same thing twice. In fact, no, because what it explains is the link of proportionality between the external intervention you'll have and the effect it will have over the long term. Napoleon's intervention is quite strong because it carries the ideas of the revolution, but it only lasts a few years, it only disturbs a few years, and so it doesn't have as great a temporal effect as the 100 Years' War, which lasts 100 years. I don't know whether it lasts 115 or 117 years. Maybe it lasts 116 years, in case I was wrong. So this fourth law is in fact a law of proportionality between external intervention and its effect. Its effect within the political community concerned. So this idea of necessary history and contingent history is important. And I'm going to end on this note by coming back to something I said a little earlier, which is that it allows... it was 116 years ago, Guillaume told me. I wasn't far off. I wasn't far off. See. Is that in fact it allows us to answer a whole host of historical riddles. And it allows you to answer, well, historical riddles. And it also answers, because we hear a lot of people say, if this had happened, then this would have happened, and that, and so on. And in fact, what most people say is completely bogus, because they'll invent things that couldn't have happened, precisely because they have no knowledge of historical terminists. Historiomics, the fundamental idea, is to say what is historically deterministic. So what can you do? What simply can't you do? And that's the way to wisdom, to know what's worth wasting energy on and what's not. So I gave you the example of Lenin and his train. The other day I had a discussion on the internet with some people who were saying what would have happened if France had won the 100 Years' War, or if England had won the 100 Years' War. And it made me laugh, because their opinion was the same as that of my thesis supervisor at the time, who had done something to us that was actually bullshit. We'd have beaten the Holy Roman Empire at the stake much more quickly. We'd have created Europe in the 15th century, and then we'd have trashed everything else. And so I explained that this isn't possible, because if you study history, you'll see that there was a national feeling that was already beginning to emerge, and which differentiated France from England. This idea that there would have been a sort of Franco-Anglia, a kingdom on both sides of the Channel, evacuates the question of ethnic geographical determinism, which I explained in my company was what determined national construction. So it ignores that. It ignores the fact that when the 100 Years' War began, the two countries were already proven national communities, since both sides already had a national representative institution, the Estates General and the Model Parliament. So, in fact, the idea was that even if one of the two countries had won, the other would eventually have declared independence from it. In fact, that's what happened in the 100 Years' War, when England regularly won, but it didn't hold because the local people didn't want it to, and so you ended up with repeated wars of independence, and that's also the question between the two. So it helps to answer questions like, how was Hitler possible? I remember when I was a kid, I used to read a lot of Historia, because my grandparents had a whole collection of Historia. It's a history magazine from the 60s. And in the 60s, they were very obsessed with precisely how Hitler was possible. It's still talked about because it fascinates people. But the question of how it could be possible seems to me to fascinate people less, but not even because it's been answered. Historians have come up with answers explaining how it happened, why there's no problem. But what's really interesting about historynomy is that it explains to you that, in fact, Hitler is banal, that he's a vengeful imperialist in a country of the first power class of civilization. Those who are at the top, or who at some point may be at the top, France, France, Germany, Russia, these are the three that have really been... Since England did this at the time of Cromwell, his revanchist imperialist was Cromwell. He was capable of massacring the Irish, but he wouldn't have been capable of imposing himself in continental Europe, for example, as Napoleon did, as Hitler did, and as the Soviet Union did. Stalin. There are many people who talk about the French Revolution, notably the enemies of the French Revolution, but you also have the fans of the French Revolution who say, we brought freedom to the world, democracy, human rights, etc. We spread all that, it's thanks to us. And then you have all those who say it's our fault, the counter-revolutionaries say it's our fault, the French Revolution spread all that, it's thanks to us. And then you've got all those who say it's our fault, the counter-revolutionaries say it's our fault, the revolution made a mess of everything, and so on. In fact, no, because the revolution is an internal movement of national revolution, an internal mechanism. What does that mean? It means that Russia would have made its revolution anyway, even if there hadn't been a French Revolution. There couldn't not have been a French Revolution, let's say, France disappeared in the 18th century before having made its revolution, no longer existing. There would have been a Russian Revolution, there would have been a German Revolution, there would have been a Spanish Revolution, or because that's part of the necessary history of these internal processes. So there's no filiation, in fact. All the attempts at filiation, you have a form of contingent filiation, since the Russian revolutionaries could probably adorn themselves with certain things. Lenin handed over the flag of the Paris Commune, for example, which was itself inspired by the insurrectionary Paris Commune of the Revolution, but this filiation is merely a rationalization, an intellectual reconstitution after all. It's not real, there's no genealogy, it's not because there was one that there's the other, alright? The Russian Revolution would probably have been different if there hadn't been the French Revolution, for X reasons. But it would have happened, there would have been a Russian national revolutionary movement at that time anyway. So it helps to sort out the uchronies, and it helps to establish the trees of possibilities. So it helps both to, as you can see, it's an analysis tool, the histonomy. It's a tool for analyzing past history. It's not just something like that that helps to create a perspective model. It has a perspective interest, since it gives you a tree of possibilities. And, you know, that's whatever the future is, it's going to be through there, this cone of possibilities. On the other hand, it also allows us to analyze the past enormously, to propose new hypotheses on subjects where we were wondering what would have happened if what was really the role of what's-his-name did, or a whole bunch of other things. You've got historians proposing causalities between this and that. Well, either you come up with historical onomy and say, yes, that's true, look, it's because we're on the same trajectory, or no, that's not it at all, it's got nothing to do with it. It's two things. It wouldn't be like what I've just told you between the French and Russian revolutions. Russian revolutions. So that's what's fundamental, that's why it's really what's at the heart of it all, and in a way, I'm ending my historionomic presentations with this, since I think I've told you just about everything about my work.